morning and welcome. I'm Greg Brown, Executive Director of the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan business policy think tank affiliated with UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. So the Kenan Institute has committed to conducting a deep dive investigation this year on a topic of substantial interest to global business and policymakers, and that's stakeholder capitalism and sort of its relevant ESG investing application, I guess. Joining us today is London Business School finance professor Alex Edmans. He's an authority on corporate social responsibility and the idea that companies which are attentive to their employees' well-being produce superior long-run stock returns. We're honored to have him as a 2022 Kenan Institute Distinguished Fellow. During this fellowship, Professor Edmans will work with us as we develop actionable insights for business leaders and policymakers. We're excited to have his contributions into our work, including those from his recent book entitled Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, which was named in the Financial Times as part of the Financial Times Business Book of the Year for 2020. He's also been named Poets and Quants MBA Professor of the Year for 2021. He's managing editor of one of the top journals in finance, the Review of Finance. So we'll hear from Professor Edmans directly before opening things up for Q&A during the second half of today's conversation. But please know that you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. But at this time, I'm pleased to turn things over to my colleague and friend, Professor Alex Edmans. Alex?
Thank you so much, Greg. It's great to be here and give this webinar, and also more generally to be engaged with the Institute as a fellow for 2022. So what I'm going to talk about today is the power of purposeful business. So we often think about purpose and we think about the moral and ethical reasons for why a company should serve wider society. And absolutely, morals and ethics are really important. But unless there's a business and financial case, purpose might always be secondary in the minds of some CEOs and some investors. So what I want to focus here is, as a professor of finance and as an investment banker in my prior life, is there actually a financial case for purpose which we can use to supplement the already compelling moral and ethical case? And so I'm going to start by a story, or taking you on a little bit of a journey to give you a view of what I mean by purpose. And this is actually quite a different view to what you typically hear. So I'm going to take you away from your home offices to halfway around the world. I'm going to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon and Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, like this one, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now, fewer than 1,000 people live around this lake, and one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Soronga, and he makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. When he sold a goat, he'd receive cash, and he'd then have to check that cash in case it was forged. He'd have to store that cash and worry about it being stolen. And then to bank that cash, he had to trek for an entire day to get to the nearest bank. So his life was really tough. He couldn't graze his goats in the greenest pastures. He always had to be within 1 day of a bank. But all of that changed due to a purposeful business. And this business was Vodafone, the UK telecoms giant. Because in 2007, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. So let me briefly explain what mobile money is, because some of us think it's mobile banking. Well, I used to live in the US. I have a Bank of America account, but I can operate it on my phone. I don't need to go down to the branch, which is great because I'm now in the UK. But that's not what mobile money is. For mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. You can transfer your money on your phone even without having an account. And that was really powerful because at the time, 15 million Kenyan adults were unbanked. So that has transformed Emmanuel's life. He doesn't need to worry about cash anymore. He doesn't need to deal with robbery or forgery. He can graze his goats where he wants to. But as academics, we know that we don't just want to base something on one single story. we want to look at large-scale research. And indeed, there was an influential paper from some MIT professors finding that within the first 7 years of launching M-Pesa, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty, and many of these households were headed up by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there was a large effect on gender equality. So that's one story I'm going to tell you about Vodafone, but I'm now going to tell you a quite different story. And this different story surrounds tax. Because in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments worldwide. And fair tax is a really important issue in telecoms because you could choose to locate your intellectual property in low tax jurisdictions. So I've got two questions for everybody here to think about. First is, which of these decisions, launching M-Pesa or releasing that tax transparency report, created most value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public anger or worsened Vodafone's ESG rating or reputation? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody here because, as Greg said, we'll have a lot of time at the end for Q&A. And the reason for not polling anybody is that most people agree with the answers. So which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. By launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender equality. But if we turn to the second question, what would have been the outrage from not launching M-Pesa? It would have been nothing, right? There would have been no public boycott. Nobody would have ever thought it was even possible to come up with this crazy idea of banking without a bank. And there would be no shaming in the newspaper because, again, this was something that would not have been expected. But what would have been the outrage for not being transparent on tax? It could be massive. And indeed, Vodafone had suffered a nationwide boycott of their stores 2 years previously. So this is why my view of purpose might be somewhat different to what you typically hear. People typically think about purpose as being the answer to that second question. Purposeful businesses should do no harm. They should not cheat on taxes. They should not pollute the environment. They should not mistreat their workers. And absolutely, that is part of a purposeful business. A purposeful business should not do those things. But purpose needs to be more than just that. Why? First is the moral and ethical case. Right, given the challenges that the world faces in 2022, I don't think it's enough for a company just to say, I'm not mistreating my workers, I'm not having some bad scandals. I think a company needs to actively do good and actively solve some of the problems of the world rather than just not enhancing them. But as I mentioned at the start of my talk, I'm going to focus this talk much more on the business and financial case. Now, often people think, well, the business and financial case for purpose is to avoid a scandal. Purpose is about good risk management. We don't want to be a Wells Fargo who engages in fake bank account creation. But if that is the case, right, purpose is something that we should just do the minimum possible to avoid a scandal. There is no need to go above and beyond. What I would like to stress is how purpose is about the answer to the first question. It's about actively creating value, doing things that you never needed to do, like creating M-Pesa. But you do them anyway because it's good for society. But also fundamentally, it is good for business. And to highlight that business and financial case, let me show you a little bit of the framework that I developed in my book, Grow the Pie, that Greg kindly mentioned. So we often think that the value that a company creates is given by a pie, and that pie can be split between investors in the form of profit and society in the form of taxes to the government and wages to workers and fair prices to customers. And we often think that purpose is about splitting the pie more fairly. Let's give a lot of profits to charity. Let's pay workers more than we can get away with. And again, don't get me wrong, part of purpose is indeed equality, but purpose must be more than that for two reasons. The first is if that purpose is about splitting the pie, then no CEO would really want to do it because it makes her company less profitable. Indeed, 2.5 years ago, we saw 181 CEOs in the US sign this Business Roundtable statement claiming they're going to serve wider society. But when the rubber hit the road, many of them didn't really put it into practice. And why would they? Why would you do something that makes your company less profitable? You should just sign a nice statement and then never do anything about it. And the second reason why purpose can't be just about pie splitting is that it's bad for investors. Now, many people think, I don't care. They like to see investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them, society is us, and if we can take from them and give to us, then the world is better off. But I need to tell this audience that investors are not them, they are us. They include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds investing for retirement, university endowments investing to fund future teaching and research. So any repurposing of business absolutely needs to take investors seriously. Profits are a key role of a well-functioning economy. So this is why I view purpose as being about growing the pie. So we absolutely do need to increase the orange, but the way we do that is not by giving a greater slice of what's already there, but through innovation, through excellence, through actively creating value, coming up with some crazy ideas like banking without a bank. Because the beauty of viewing purpose as value creation is that even though Vodafone genuinely wanted to create social value, not financial value, they genuinely just wanted to solve the problem of financial inclusion in Kenya. After they did that, they found a way to monetize it. And that's why investors became better off as well. The blue increased. So at this point in my talk, you might think, well, everything I've said sounds great, but where's the evidence? It sounds a bit like wishful thinking. But I'm saying companies should just think about creating value for society and magically some profits will appear, but that almost seems too good to be true. Right, yes, I've told you the story of Vodafone, but how do you know that I didn't just handpick this one story? It might be that's the exception, not the rule. So that's why it's great to work with UNC on this, and just not for this talk, but more generally the Kenan Institute across the whole year, to look at the rigorous large-scale research and to go beyond just stories and case studies. When we look at hundreds of companies across dozens of industries over multiple years, is it indeed true that purposeful companies can perform better? And the important thing here is to stress the criticality of research being rigorous. And this is because of the idea of confirmation bias. That is, when you would just like to accept evidence if it confirms what we would like to be true. And that's a particular problem in a responsible business, right? We would love to believe that purposeful companies always perform better. So if there was a study claiming that, we might latch onto it uncritically, even if the evidence is quite weak. And I gave a TED talk a couple of years ago, what to trust in a post-truth world, about just how careful we need to be when it's on a topic where we have quite strong feelings. And just to give you an example of that, let me go through a recent study done by the UK regulator, the Financial Reporting Council, on diversity. Now, that's something that I, and I'm sure everybody on this webinar, really cares strongly about, right? Me as an ethnic minority myself, but also caring about gender diversity and many other forms of diversity. Now, this regulator released a report claiming that the more the diversity in the boardroom, the greater the financial performance, and they chose the measure of financial performance being EBITDA margin. But then when I looked at the actual study itself and the results for EBITDA margin, what I found is that out of the 90 regressions they ran, not a single one was significant. So in the executive summary, they claimed to have found these results, and indeed everybody took this at face value. There were so many headlines about the study, but if you just took a moment to look at the tables, nothing was significant. And the big embarrassment for me was that this study was not done by the Financial Reporting Council. They published it, but it was done by my own institution, London Business School. And the Dean of London Business School said at the start, This academic rigor yields new insights we all stand to learn from the author's methodology and findings. So for me, I obviously would love a London Business School study on a topic that I really care about, diversity, to show the positive results, but I need to step away from my own personal bias towards my employer and also my bias towards diversity, and to look dispassionately at the data. And unfortunately, in the study, the data did not match the claim. So what I want to look at now is, what does careful research say about whether purpose pays off? And this is something that I looked at myself about 15 years ago. So one of the big challenges for anything about purpose is, well, how do we measure it? Now, you might think, can we just look at a company's purpose statement and see which companies have the best purpose statements? We might be doing some textual analysis. But that's problematic, because some companies might say some great things, but not actually put them into practice. So you might think, well, don't we just look at which companies put the money where their mouth is? Right, how much do companies donate to charity? How much do they pay their workers? But that measures the input, not the output. Right, so you could just spend loads of money on charity, but you might not give to the right charity. And anyone here who's a sports fan will know that actually the teams that spend the most on players might not be delivering the best results. And on the flip side, there might be some companies who do some great things for society. If you have a great boss at work who gives you meaningful work and skills development and mentorship, that doesn't cost her anything, but it makes a big difference to you. So what I wanted to look at is not what companies say, not even how much they spend, but how much value they create for society. And so what I looked at was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America, which is how well a company treats its workers. And notice this looks at the active value creation, how these companies go right into the above and beyond. It's not just avoiding scandals, avoiding strikes and so on, but going above and beyond and making your company a great place to work. So why was that my measure of purpose? Right? Why don't I look at the environment or government taxes or something? It's because this is something which matters in every industry. In virtually every company, employees are critical. Now, climate change is absolutely a really important threat, but it matters much more in, let's say, energy than tech. So I wanted to look at something which was important for all industries. And the other reason why I looked at this is that I had tons of data, because this data started in 1984. Now, purpose is a pretty new phenomenon, and so many data sources have only been around, let's say, since 2010. And if I showed you that companies that were purposeful did well between 2010 and 2019, you might think, well, those were 10 great years for the stock market. Maybe purpose only does well in an upswing. Maybe in a pandemic or when there's a war, we should just focus on the bottom line and not be distracted by purpose. But because my data started in 1984, I had things like the financial crisis, like September the 11th and the collapse of the internet bubble, so I could make sure that this was something that does well in bad times as well as good. So what was the bottom line? I found that these 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So step back from the numbers, what does that mean? Like, companies that are treating their workers well, they are being moral and ethical, but they're being more than that. They're being financially and commercially astute. They're investing in their biggest asset. They're not just giving them parts of the pie. By treating their workers well, they're more motivated and more productive. They're growing the pie, and shareholders are being better off as a result. Now, at the start, I mentioned the importance of being very careful with evidence and not just latching onto conclusions we like. So you look at this correlation, but you might think, well, could there be some other alternative explanations for this? Maybe there's what we call in finance omitted variables. Maybe in the tech industry, people are happy, and the tech industry happens to have done well. So when I talk about the peers, I have to control for what industry you're in, the size of the company, recent performance, valuation ratios, and a whole host of other factors. But then there's another problem. You might think, well, what about unobservable variables that you can't control for? Let's say a company has a great CEO, and that great CEO treats her employees well, and that great CEO leads to good performance anyway. So what I have to do is to do something different, and this is a different technique. What I looked at was analyst expectations. So every 3 months in the US, as you know, companies will announce their earnings. And before they do that, the likes of Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley, my former firm, will predict the earnings. And when they do so, right, they will take management quality into account. What analysts claim is they spend all their time talking to management, and so their analyst forecast should incorporate how good the manager is. But what I found was that these best companies were systematically doing better than what analysts were expecting. So there must be something beyond just management quality and other things that analysts take into account, which was driving the higher return. Now, even if you believe everything I've just shown you, and even if you believe the validity of the study, you might still be skeptical, because you might think, does this show anything about purpose? Yes, companies that treat their workers better do better, but isn't it sufficient for a company just to think about profit? Maybe all a company needs to do is to try and think, how do I make as much money as possible? And even if your only goal is profit, you will still invest in your workers, because you know, happier workers make for more productive workers, and I'm going to make more money. Indeed, let's think about, say, building an electric car factory. Now, some people might build an electric car factory because they care about climate change. But what if you only cared about money? You would still build the electric car factory. Like, you would do the net present value analysis we teach you, and you're going to forecast, yeah, the net present value of this car factory is huge. Why? Because the demand for electric cars is going to be really, really high. So in fact, we don't even need to care about purpose. All we need to do is to think about long-term profit, and it's going to cause you to make all of these positive decisions. But actually, I disagree with this. Why? Because that approach of net present value, that assumes that you can replace and reduce every decision to a financial calculation. Yes, you can do that with electric cars. You can put that into a spreadsheet, and yes, the world is uncertain, but we know how to deal with uncertainty. You can just do a sensitivity analysis by changing the selling price of electric cars. But how could you do a net present value calculation on something like M-Pesa? Like, what is the profit from launching mobile money? It was probably not even going to work to begin with. The tech challenges were huge. Nobody had ever developed anything like mobile money before. And even if you could pull it off, where was the profit to be made from serving some of the poorest people in the world? At the time, Vodafone's strategy was to win spectrum license auctions in the West, because that's where the market was the strongest. So this is why I think purpose is so powerful. This is why I think purpose has such a strong business case, because what it does is it frees us from having to justify every decision with a financial calculation. It instead allows us to do things just because it's good business and good for society. It allows us to justify things like M-Pesa. Now, ultimately, they might become successful in the long term, and they might ultimately lead to the company becoming profitable. But you could have never predicted the profit from the outset. Why? Because it's hard to forecast more than a few years out. And also, often, profits come from sources that you never expected. So where is the evidence that actually profits might be unexpected? Well, Caroline Flammer, she's a strategy professor now at Columbia. And what she did is she gathered shareholder proposals to make a company more responsible. So that's when shareholders go to a company's annual general meeting and they'll ask it to implement a climate change policy or an anti-discrimination policy. And she uses a technique called regression discontinuity to find that after these proposals are passed, sales go up, profits go up, and the stock price go up. So that's striking, right? Because even though those proposals aimed to create value for society, they also created profits because by serving society better, this grew the pie and the company became more financially successful. But here's the even more powerful point. Right, these proposals should not have been needed if the profit mindset is enough. Right, any CEO should know that anti-discrimination is good for profits because it will improve employee morale. So they should have put these policies into place anyway. But they didn't. It took the diverse perspectives of outside shareholders one step removed from the day-to-day focus on profits to open up the eyes of these CEOs and make them put these policies into place. So the final part of my talk is, well, how do we put purpose into practice, right? We've said it's important. We've said there's a business case behind it, more than just long-term profit. But then how does a company become purposeful? And the important question is to ask, well, what does it mean to be purposeful? Nowadays, everybody's talking about purpose. From the CEO of BlackRock, the largest investor in the world, to Princeton, a puppet in Avenue Q, he talks about finding his purpose. But everybody talks about purpose without ever defining what it means. So how I define purpose is as the following. It's why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. Now, that might sound pretty lofty and pretty idealistic, so let me focus on picking it apart. Why you exist, who you serve, your reason for being, and the role that you play, they all need to be targeted and focused. Right? So we often think about purpose as being about altruism. A purposeful company is one that serves wider society. A purposeful person is one who doesn't think about themselves, they think about everybody else. But if you think about it, what does the word purpose mean in the English language? It means being focused and targeted. Right? A purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So why you exist, who you serve, your reason for being, and the role you play, they all need to be specific. But then you might think, well, how do we decide what to focus on? The question I think that every company should ask themselves is, what is in my hand? What are the resources and what is the expertise that my company has, and how can I use this to serve wider society if I just think a little bit more creative? So Vodafone realized that it could take its expertise in transferring text messages and use that expertise to transfer money instead. And so that's why they chose to solve financial inclusion rather than one of the world's many other challenges. But the United Nations has 17 sustainable development goals. But it's not a company's responsibility to solve every single one of the world's problems, but to focus on the 3 or 4 where it can really move the needle. And the power of seeing purpose as using what's in your hand is that it allows all companies to play their part, regardless of how large or small they are. So we often think about purpose as splitting the pie differently, donating millions to charity or giving free products. And that's great, but only some companies can do that. Indeed, what we saw in the coronavirus pandemic was some heroic activities by some companies. Unilever donated 150 million euros of food and sanitizer to local communities. They gave up part of the pie to help others. Now that's inspiring, but it's also intimidating, because what if you're a small company? You don't have 150 million euros lying around. You don't have pie that you can give. So how can you help out in a crisis? By asking yourself, what's in your hand? What can I do to grow the pie? Because that's something that you don't need money to do. All you need is this purpose and this mindset shift. So what we saw in the pandemic was companies in completely unrelated industries and small companies play their part. So let me give you an example of an unrelated company and also a small company that I'm a customer of. It's called Barry's Bootcamp. So this is a brutal chain of gyms in London, and these gyms that are around the US in many, many states. It started off in California. Now, these gyms were shut during the pandemic because obviously of the lockdown. But what is in their hand is fitness expertise. And they use that to offer free Instagram fitness classes, which made a huge difference when everybody is self-isolating at home. Now you might think, well, a fitness company doesn't need a purpose to think about offering free fitness classes. Isn't this kind of obvious? But what's really interesting is what the Barry's desk workers did. So these were the reception desk workers when you check yourself in at the gym. Now the gym was shut, so what did these desk workers do? Well, it turns out that many of these desk workers are actors as their main job. And if you're an actor, your income is pretty volatile, so that's why they took this desk job to provide themselves with income stability. And if you're a desker, what is in your hand? You're really entertaining. Well, how does that help out? Well, what we had in the pandemic was schools were shut because children were at home. So what Barry's offered was free Zoom storytelling sessions and other online entertainment to take the load off their working parents, so when their parents had an important call, then their kids could do these Barry Zoom storytelling sessions, and this made a huge difference. And also the power of what's in my hand is not only does it allow all companies to play their part, large and small, but it allows all people to play their part. But so far in this talk, I've always talked about purposeful companies. But companies don't make decisions, people make decisions. Now, if purpose involves spending money, donating millions to charity, then only the CEO can make the decision. But if purpose involves using what's in your hand, that's something that every employee can do, no matter how senior you are. And importantly, you can also do that no matter how purposeful your company currently is. So as I alluded to earlier, my first job was at Morgan Stanley in investment banking, right, which is a pretty cutthroat industry, not often one that's associated with purpose. And I started off right at the bottom in a position called analyst. And I thought I had nothing in my hand. Right? Nobody worked for me. I worked for the associate, and he worked for the vice president, who worked for the executive director, and so on. But I actually realized I did have something in my hand because some people did work for me. My secretary worked for me. So did the IT department, and perhaps the most abused department in an investment bank is the graphics department. So you typically give them some unintelligible scribble, and they turn that into some beautiful PowerPoint slides. Now, analysts would often shout at graphics for not doing what they wanted, even though it was often your fault for not explaining it clearly enough. So there was many occasions when graphics did a good job. And so I would call them up and I'd say, hi, this is Alex. Can you put me through to whoever did my job? And I'd say, well, this was a great job. Right? All these three things I asked for, you did it well. And this fourth thing I didn't even ask for, but you did it anyway. Now, sincerely, I didn't say thank you to just be seen as a nice person, to be seen as a goody-goody. I just said it because I thought it was the right thing to do. But because I was so junior, because I was right at the bottom of the bank, I didn't have my own office. I sat in what they call the bullpen, this open plan floor where all the junior analysts and the secretaries sit. Because I didn't have my own office, when I would say thank you, the other analysts started to hear me, and then they decided to start saying thank you themselves. Now, I'm not going to claim that we transformed the entire culture of this global investment bank. Clearly, we didn't. But perhaps on that 7th floor of those offices in Canary Wharf, London, people started treating each other a little bit more kindly. What was in our hand was not rank or status, it was just our words, but that was something which still made a little bit of a difference. So we often think about ourselves as a thermometer, right? So a thermometer is something which reflects the temperature around you. So if the atmosphere around you is cutthroat, then you might think, well, I need to be cutthroat myself to survive, which is also what we often think about in an investment bank. But what this suggests is that everybody, from CEO to analyst, has the power to play thermostat and to affect the temperature around. So before I hand back to Greg for the Q&A, let's just sum up, well, why I think purpose is so powerful. Right, for so many years, finance professors, and including me, I'm going to blame myself, what we've said is we should make decisions based on financial forecasts. And that works for many decisions. I'm not going to throw the baby out of the bathwater. Any decision where you can project the future with some degree of certainty, you should use net present value. And if there is uncertainty, there are ways of dealing with the uncertainty. You can do something like a sensitivity analysis. But what about some decisions which are truly intangible, where it's impossible to even begin to think about a midpoint forecast of cash flows. Let's say we're a company, we're thinking about giving more parental leave to our employees. Yes, we have some sense that the employees will become more motivated and more likely to stay, but how can we turn that into a cash flow? There is no way we can think about it. If Unilever thinks about what's the payoff from donating the food and sanitizer, yes, they have some sense they're going to build their reputation, but it's again very difficult to translate that into a cash flow. And the same with the other examples of Vodafone and M-Pesa, or even Barry's and this Zoom storytelling sessions. But the power of purpose is that it allows us to do things for intrinsic, non-instrumental reasons, because it's the right thing to do, and often afterwards, profits will follow. Now, this does not unlock us and does not give us a license to do anything we want to and think that anything that we do to serve society will ultimately benefit us. But what I've highlighted is the idea of what's in our hand, the idea of using our comparative advantage, our expertise, our resources, and if what we do to serve society is absolutely linked to our expertise, that's something where it won't cost us a huge amount to create, and therefore it's even more likely that actually, even if we're doing it to serve wider society, ultimately the pie will grow and ultimately profits will also increase, even though those higher profits were never the reason for that social value creation to begin. Thanks so much again to Greg for the invitation. Thank you everybody for giving up an hour to listen to my thoughts. Let me just hand back now for the Q&A.
Well, fantastic, Alex. Thank you so much. That was really an amazing talk. Want to again thank you before we get into QA for taking the time to be with us and give us your insights on this. And we've had several questions come in on the chat, but I'm going to use my executive director privilege to ask the first question, because it's something I've been struggling with as we dive into this topic around stakeholder capitalism. And I had a hard time getting out of the intro, but I personally think of ESG investing as sort of the expression or embodiment in some ways, like it's an actionable paradigm for stakeholder capitalism. But I don't think that it's exactly the same as purposeful business, right? Stakeholder capitalism. It seems like it's a little bit of a different view in terms of thinking about what objectives of business should be, how companies should think about their actions that go beyond just financial gain. So how do you differentiate what you think of as the purpose of business from the maybe what the Business Roundtable describes as stakeholder capitalism?
Thanks, Ray. That's a really important question. So I think that there's a lot in common with purpose and stakeholder capitalism, but I think the main challenge the stakeholder capitalism movement has is it really hasn't defined what stakeholder capitalism involves. And I'm just going to quickly flash up an article I wrote in Forbes, just say, well, there's no definition, and I'm trying to propose a definition. And my definition might not be the right one, but before we have a debate about it and whether it's good or bad, let's first have a definition so that we know what we're talking about. And many people, when they think about stakeholder capitalism, they view it as anti-shareholder capitalism. And if you look at sort of what are the ways in which they want to implement it, let's change directors' duties to make them think about stakeholders, not shareholders. And then often people think about profit as being a dirty word. But what I've tried to highlight in my talk is actually, if a company is profitable in the long term, it shouldn't be embarrassed about that. It could well be profitable in the long term because they've created value for wider society. So when I'm thinking about purpose, I'm about creating shared value rather than pitting stakeholders versus shareholders. And indeed, many of the things that people see as enemies to stakeholder capitalism, like shareholder activism, when you look at some of the careful research about this, actually many forms, although not all, but certainly many forms of shareholder activism do serve wider society in the long term. So I think that one of the challenges that stakeholder capitalism faces is actually thinking it's a fixed by its stakeholders instead of shareholders, when there's actually some ways in which you can create shared value.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that makes really good sense. I'm going to turn now to some of the Q&A that's come in. First question is, data indicates that equity ownership is increasingly concentrated among wealthier households. How does this change the calculus for many stakeholders? And I would guess in particular, what it makes me think of is, you brought up the example of shareholder proposals being necessary to incentivize managers to undertake certain actions. So, how does the actual composition of shareholders influence these types of decisions?
Right, this is a great question. And actually, I might combine this question with Christian Lundberg's question, which is, what is the role of government here? And he says, well, there are things like externalities, like climate. Doesn't the government need to come in and tax these things? I think this is really important, because whose responsibility is it to set the non-financial objectives for a company? Now, there's some people who think it's investors who should do this. So like the Larry Finks of this world are telling companies how much carbon they're allowed to emit, who they're allowed to hire in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. But one of the challenges of this is what was said in Gerald's question, is who are the shareholders? They're the wealthy. They are the 1%. So some of these really difficult challenges, there are trade-offs, right? Climate change is really, really important. But if you shut down all polluting plants, you're going to make a lot of people redundant. And you might think they are the 99%, they're not really well reflected by the asset management industry. So if we leave it just to asset managers to decide these things, it may well be that they're not actually representing the aggregate electorate. So Christian's approach, which is one that I fully subscribe to, is that in many of these things, they should be democratic decisions, right? So when you have a government that is elected where everybody has one vote, and they can vote on what governments they would like to have in place. So one argument, which I'll at least put it here, not everyone might agree with it, is that why do we still allow fossil fuels? Why might we not have a carbon tax? Is, well, the aggregate citizens of the world, so the aggregate citizens of the US have elected a government where they actually think, yes, climate change is really important, but we think that actually there are other considerations here also. Now, there's at least two problems with the statement that I just made. One of them is maybe the government is not effective due to lobbying. So maybe there's been heavy lobbying by the fossil fuel industry, which means that the government is not following aggregate preferences. And that's something that is indeed very sympathetic to. But before we first think about playing the role of government and usurping government, we first have to think, well, why the government might have failed. So we might think the government has failed on carbon, and I personally believe there should be a carbon tax. But what about some of the other social issues? Let's say inequality. There's some people who believe no matter how well a CEO has done, it's just morally wrong to pay her more than, I don't know, $20 million or something, because this leads to income inequality. But who does it deal with income inequality? The government does it. And the government has the tax system to do that. And the electorate can choose for a government which is going to have a more progressive tax or a less progressive tax. And given the government has the tools to do that, well, then that's something that I think we should be leaving to government. The second flaw with my argument of leaving everything to government is that there's some things that cannot be regulated because they can't be measured. So you can measure carbon, you can measure income and have an income tax, but you cannot measure things like corporate culture, and so therefore you can't fine a company. So that's when shareholders have to step in and to have these proposals on something like anti-discrimination. So my overall answer to both Gerald's and Christian's questions is, if these are things that the government can deal with, it should be dealt with government policy, not with by the asset management industry. Why? Because government policy is more democratic. But there are things where the government cannot deal with them. It could be because the government is ineffective. And it might be why we have Climate 100, because we think that actually the government should be taking action. They're not reflecting the aggregate preferences of the nation, and we need to take action. Or it's something that the government just can't deal with because it's something qualitative. But I think the first starting point, before we all try to play the role of government, is, has the government failed? Yes, the government fails in many cases, but if it hasn't failed, then maybe it's something that we should first leave to the government.
No, that's a great perspective. And in some ways, it kind of leads, at least part of that leads into this next question, which is, how should we be measuring a company's success with regard to living into its purpose? What metrics should business leaders consider employing? And as a side note to this, when we started digging into this, we realized that the measurement issues were huge. It's kind of the Wild West out there still in terms of, how people are putting together, ESG metrics, for example. And I guess my follow on to this question would be, do you think the paradigms that are emerging around ESG are sort of sufficient in some way or evolve in some way to capture your notion of purpose?
Absolutely. Again, this is a really important question. It's like, yeah, companies can have a purpose, but Mackenzie's question is about accountability. So how can you measure whether a company's being purposeful? So certainly as a finance professor, I really believe that data is really useful. However, data is very limited still because there are many dimensions of purpose that you can't fully measure. So let's go back to something like diversity and inclusion. Yes, you can measure things like the percentage of minorities on the board or in the wider workforce or in senior management. But how can you measure things such as a corporate culture which genuinely allows people to be themselves and to speak up and so forth? So let's just give an example. I'm not going to name the organization, but I'm on the board of this organization where they've had a big push to recruit other female board members, which is great. And then the last meeting, I asked the chairman, why have we not followed up with this after this discussion? And he said, well, this discussion, it was really split, so we're not going to do anything. And I said, well, actually, it wasn't split. Actually, it was, my memory of this was that it was really sort of 80-20, yet all of the people who were in favor were women. And like the two people who were against were men. Was it some unconscious bias that sort of led you to discount the female board members? Obviously, I said it a bit more diplomatically than that. But what that's saying is that, yeah, we can always tick the box with diversity and inclusion, but are we actually putting this into practice? And sort of the problem that I have with this data-driven approach to measuring purpose is that you can hit the target, but miss the point. Right, so one analogy I often use is the US No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. So the debate that we're having about measuring ESG is pretty similar to the debate back then about measuring school performance, right? We want to bring accountability, the same language we're using here, and we're going to use that to decide capital allocation, which schools do we fund and which do we shut down. And so what we did is came up with some consistent, standard, comparable metrics, which were standardized test scores, but we know that what that led to was teaching to the test. And so what I fear here is that, yes, we are coming up with these frameworks, but if there's so much focus put on them, then people might start teaching to the test, i.e. just trying to look good on those particular metrics. So that's not to say we should completely ignore the data, right? If you claim to be committed to diversity and your board is just full of white men, then clearly you haven't lived up to it. We should look at the data, but make sure that we know that the data is not everything. Like when Greg and I and our institutions, we do tenure decisions. Yes, we will look at the number of publications, but we will also try to read the papers and to take some qualitative stuff into account. And here, yes, it's great that we have some data, but I think we should also think about sort of the qualitative stuff too. I know it's a long answer to the question, but because this is such a rich question, I'm breaking it down to two parts. The second part was, what metrics should business leaders consider employing? Now, yes, people think about ESG and purpose right now, but they think about it as some completely new thing, where let's just get on this ESG bandwagon and come up with some new thing to show how well we're doing on ESG, this huge set of metrics. But I see ESG as just like non-financial information. And we've thought about non-financial information for about 30 years. Some of you will know the balanced scorecard idea of Kaplan and Norton. And what they said is that we want to expand our measure of performance from just beyond revenues and profits to things like customer satisfaction, net promoter scores, employee turnover, and all of those things. And all they thought about was what was the non-financial information that was relevant for the business. They talked about leading indicators. A leading indicator is only a leading indicator if it leads to something, if it leads to long-term performance. And so what measures should business leaders consider employing? They should be the ESG measures that will ultimately lead to financial performance in the future. And that is often different from the ESG metrics, which are often imposed by outside pressure groups. So you might have these standard setting bodies, but it might be what's relevant for one particular business is not relevant for somebody else. Or you might have these stakeholders who says everybody should report issue X, when that issue might matter for some industries and not for others. So what I like companies to think about is ESG as just non-financial key performance indicators. What for your business is something that you would want to track internally as a management team to figure out whether your business is on the right track.
Yeah. So I want to move on to this next question from Kirk Redmond. Have you applied your analysis to stated purposeful companies like B Corps? Is there an inherent advantage to being a B Corp versus a normal incorporation?
Yeah, another really important question, Kirk. And again, my view on this, not everybody might agree with, but I see that B Corp, and many people view this as a panacea. So there are some people who claim you're not a truly purposeful organization unless you get B Corp certification. But this is a bit linked to some of the challenges that I mentioned in my last response. Is that B Corp, they measure various stuff, but how do you know that the company's not just doing well on the measures and not on the more qualitative dimensions of purpose, which is really difficult to measure? Also, these measures often differ. So some of you will know that ESG ratings differ from provider to provider. That means that there's no one clear definition of what it means to be a purposeful company. People just disagree, and that's fair. Right? I might care much more about climate change. You might care much more about diversity and inclusion. And so it's not clear to me why B Corp or B Lab, which provides certification, is the one supreme enlightened being who gets to decide which companies are ethical and which companies are unethical. It's just like if there was some ranking of ethical finance professors and people were labeled ethical or not, you might have a problem with that because people might have different views of different standards and relative weighting of teaching versus research. So this is absolutely not to say that B Corp is not a good thing, but if you're a company who has an aspiration to become a B Corp, that might be good aspiration internally. But I say do it if it's going to change you internally. Don't do it so that you can tell others that you have B Corp status. So often I will tell myself before taking on a challenge, let's say I choose to, I don't know, run a marathon or do a triathlon, would I still do it if I wasn't able to tell anybody I did it? And if the answer is no, the only reason to run a marathon is I could post on Facebook I ran the marathon. That's not the reason to do it. But if I'm going to choose to run the marathon because I want to commit myself to an exercise regime and to eat more healthily, then I think that's the reason to do that. And I say the same is true for B Corp.
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic perspective. So I want to move on to another question here. How do you suggest we get consumers to care more and take more action against companies who do bad things in society? And question cites specific examples of Apple and the suicides at Foxconn and DuPont and pollution from PFOAs.
I think this is really important. We often think that now companies are so large that an individual consumer is just tiny. We really can't do anything from this. But I do think customers now have even more power than they did in the past. Yes, you might only be one person and their revenues might be billions, but the effect of a customer boycott, say delete Uber or boycott Volkswagen, can be huge. And notice you might have even more power than investors, right? We often think about investors divesting, but as you know, an investor cannot sell without another investor buying. So at least in the short term, you can't deprive a company of capital. Whereas if customers stop buying, it might be that nobody comes in and fills a place. So you might actually be depriving a company of capital. So if indeed there's companies which do things which are unethical, if customers take action and these things can actually spread, then that can actually be something which is quite powerful. And this is indeed, I think, one of the reasons why many companies are taking action on many of these important societal issues. Yeah, part of it might be moral and ethical, but part of it is just business realities. If you're not leading the way in many of these societal issues, it may well be that customers are going to be walking away from you.
Yep. So I think we got time for maybe one or two more questions. So next one's from John Roden. He says, I think a lot of employees have purposeful ideas, but getting management to approve them is still a challenge. How can we change senior management to be more open to these types of ideas?
Yeah, I'm going to be very biased in my response as an academic, but I think it's with evidence. And so this is why not just me, but many other professors who work on this try to use data and evidence. So often people use this guilt tripping approach, saying companies need to be more purposeful because of your moral obligations. And again, morals and ethics are really important. But if you're showing, well, actually, purpose does lead to long-term shareholder returns if it's guided by things like comparative advantage and materiality, and also some evidence on the power of employee decision-making and participation. I think those are things which do matter. So what I put in the book, and it's not just me, but many other authors, have given examples of things which were proposed by employees which end up being great ideas. This is why Google had something like the 20% time, where they invented, I believe it's things like Google Maps, where just employees were given freedom to explore and make suggestions. And so when you can have both the data, but also the case studies and examples, this will show that actually it's something where you want to be purposeful and you want to listen to employees to do that, rather than just thinking as a management, I have purpose and everybody's going to follow what I'm telling them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I think maybe one more question here, and this is actually in some ways is very related to that question, because it's thinking about sort of the deeper issues inside of an organization around ESG and purpose. So I think that many companies manage their ESG efforts at the top of the house, and purpose-driven action is not a socialized concept throughout the organization. You suggest companies make purpose-driven efforts ingrained in how teams operate day to day. So I mean, thinking about it sort of maybe the other way in terms of trying to put systems in place that actively encourage purpose or ESG thinking.
Yeah, this is another really important thing. Otherwise, purpose just is a nice mission statement, and then it doesn't filter through. So there's one senior manager who told me about the clay, which is the fact that there's something which blocks purpose from filtering through. So I think there's two things that are important. So one of them is to involve employees in purpose formation. So as I briefly alluded to earlier, people think, well, management goes to an offsite, comes up with a great purpose statement, and then tells everybody to implement that. But you can't. So often what companies will do is to include employees in purpose formation. And sometimes they might go beyond employees. They might involve their customers. So the UK's National Health Service, the purpose is really important because it's in the Constitution and that's enshrined into law. And so when they came up with the purpose internally, they said it's to help people recover. Makes sense as a health service. But then when they talked to patients, the patients highlighted the importance of a decent death when the time came. And as a service so focused on wellness and recovery, they might have forgotten the importance of actually palliative care. And so now that is part of the National Health Service's purpose in the Constitution. So first is to involve people in the actual formation. But the second is to try and have teams which will try to make sure that purpose is implemented. So sometimes a purpose statement might be pretty broad. So within Lloyds Bank in the UK, it's like helping Britain prosper. Really vague and really broad. What does it mean for particular units? And so their companies will have particular purpose teams that will come into individual departments and think about, well, what does purpose mean for your particular unit? Novo Nordisk has a team, they call them facilitators, to make sure that Novo Nordisk's purpose is translated into local customs, because they know that they're operating in lots of different jurisdictions. They'll both translate this and they'll also report back up to management as to what are the challenges. Now, this might seem like really deliberate, really mechanical, but I would say it's intentional, right? So anything you care about, you're not just going to say, let's do it and just sort of leave all of the cards to fall. I'm going to try to intentionally think about how to put this into practice. And yeah, maybe at the start it's mechanical, it's formulaic, but after a time, hopefully you won't need those purpose teams in there. It will be ingrained into the culture. But I think it's giving respect to the magnitude of the problem that you're going to have a dedicated department or dedicated teams to put this into practice.
Yep. Makes great sense. Well, it looks like we're right at time now. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but to the audience, please do reach out to us directly if you'd like to continue the conversation. You can find the best email address to direct questions to in the chat. I think Sydney's put it up. Yep. One more reminder, you're certainly welcome to check out the full scope of our work to date on stakeholder capitalism and ESG investing by visiting kenaninstitute.unc.edu. You'll see a banner that goes across the top of our homepage. So thank you again, Alex, for joining us today. This was really fantastic. Thank you, audience, for being with us. And we hope that you'll join us again for future events.